Hello everybody, this is Paul, and I'd just like to thank you all for buying our records during the past year. We know you've been buying them because the sales have been very good, you see. Don't know where we'd be without you, really, though.
In the army, perhaps.
As soon as they wrapped up work on A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles were thrust into a whirlwind of international tours and the frenzy of Beatlemania. It was during this exhausting schedule that Lennon and McCartney cranked out many of the tunes that became the backbone of Beatles For Sale. The second side of A Hard Day's Night had already shown a more introspective side to their music, and that direction carried over into John and Paul's songwriting for their fourth album. Despite the PR hype that the two had enough great songs to fill albums for years, they were beginning to feel the pressure of coming up with fresh material, and felt obligated to resurrect old compositions written years before. By this time, Bob Dylan had become the major influence on the Beatles. His raw energy and lyrical style had electrified folk circles, and albums like Freewheelin' and The Times They Are A-Changin' had established him as a force to be reckoned with. As both were unique for being prolific enough to complete LPs with their own material, Dylan and the Beatles were bound to eventually collide and react, inspiring each other. George was the first to dive into Dylan's music and quickly became a devoted fan. He introduced John to Freewheelin', who passed the summer of 1964 exploring Dylan's output in his own special way, absorbing its sound, mood, and tone. Dylan's influence wasn't limited to the Beatles, though. It was sweeping through the burgeoning British pop aristocracy. Groups like the Animals were making waves with covers of Dylan tracks, including their massive hit, House of the Rising Sun. At this period, John was spending much of his time nightclubbing with the Animals' Eric Burdon and the Rolling Stones' Mick Jagger, and his idea of Dylan was formed through their shared enthusiasm for folk blues and R&B. The big turning point came on August 28, 1964, when the Beatles met Dylan at Manhattan's Delmonico Hotel after a show at Forest Hills. Up to that point, the boys had relied on alcohol and amphetamines to keep up their energy during tours, but there they were introduced to something new: marijuana.
Until we happened upon marijuana, we'd been drinking, men. We were introduced to grass when we were in the US, and it blew our tiny little minds. I've touched on this before, but exactly what happened is that we were in a hotel suite, maybe in New York around the summer of '64, and Bob Dylan turned up with his roadie, the kind of guy who was more than a roadie, an assistant, friend, sidekick. He'd just released another side of Bob Dylan, and we were just drinking, as usual, having a little party. We'd ordered drinks from room service, scotch and coke, and French wine were our things back then. And Bob had disappeared into a back room. We thought maybe he'd gone to the toilet, but then Ringo came out of that back room looking a bit strange. He said, "I've just been with Bob, and he's got some pot," or whatever you called it then. And we said, "Oh, what's it like?" And he said, "Well, the ceiling is sort of moving, coming down," and that was enough. After Ringo said that, the other three of us leapt into the back room where Dylan was, and he gave us a puff on a joint. We thought, wow, this is pretty amazing, this stuff. And so it became part of our repertoire from then on. How did we get our pot? To tell you the truth, it just showed up. There were certain people you could get it from. You just had to know who had some.
The result was a revelation. Paul, who seems to have had an out-of-body experience, declared he was really thinking for the first time. That night marked a shift for the Beatles. The wild, chaotic highs of alcohol and amphetamines gave way to the reflective, mind-expanding effects of marijuana, and eventually LSD in the next year. As for Dylan, the Beatles' musical vitality prompted his return to the rock and roll that motivated him as a teenager. The result? Bringing It All Back Home, one of the 1960s most influential albums. With a Christmas release in mind, the boys began recording their new album in August of '64, barely a week after A Hard Day's Night had topped the charts on both sides of the Atlantic. Their new songs showed noticeable growth compared to their earlier work. They were also becoming more comfortable in the studio. This being their second full album recorded on a 4-track machine, we begin to see their thirst for experimentation with different instruments emerge, as the boys step out of their usual guitar, bass, and drums format for broader horizons. In this documentary, we'll explore the stories behind the songs, the influences that shape them, and the cultural impact of an album that marked the end of their early era and the beginning of something deeper. This is the story of Beatles for Sale.
Thank you, man.
Okay.
She's got a little package for you.
I have to give you a kiss.
Go on then.
Oh, great. Whoa.
The Beatles are great, Harvey Henry says so. Hey, the Beatles are great. Hey, the Beatles are great. They're great.
The question is, can you take 14,000 children and pack them in to one stadium? And they know they're coming there to get hysterical. And the whole show was based upon producing hysteria, the preliminary acts as well as the Beatles. And then these girls went into a coma.
Go ahead, Ralph. Go right behind.
They ranted, they fainted, their eyes were glassy. Some pulled their hair out, some tore their dresses. They threw notes of a very undesirable nature on the stage.
But was there ever a point where you felt that the success was just seemed to almost be getting out of control, where it was difficult to deal with?
Yeah, that was that period. I mean, it was then when it got out of control that was, I suppose, contributed to us going into sort of semi-retirement, because it just became too difficult. And one of the things was that the whole Beatlemania in the 60s, I think, even though at first we all got off on it, I think the world, or the pop or music world, got off on it either more than we did or as much as we did, but then they carried it too far, you know, where it was cute for the policeman to have bullets in his ears and have pictures of everybody screaming, and for, you know, the Pope to wear a Beatle wig, and it got to the point where the Beatles, you know, the Beatles became like an excuse for everybody to freak out. You know, they'd say, oh, well, the Beatles are in town, it's Beatlemania.
The output of the legendary Lennon and McCartney songwriting team has become one of the most loved and highly esteemed catalogs in popular music. With such diverse personalities, which became even more diverse as their partnership developed through the years, they maintained their cohesiveness by adopting various songwriting formulas. While they started off in their formative years, skipping school to meet and write songs together from scratch, they found this practice somewhat burdensome to maintain. It would be daft to sit around waiting for a partner to finish your song off with you, Paul once said. If you happen to be on your own, you might as well get it finished yourself. If I get stuck on the middle 8 of a new number, I give up, knowing that when I see John, he will finish it off for me. He'll bring a new approach to it, and that particular song will finish up half and half, Lennon and McCartney. They decided that this newer approach, finishing off a near-completed idea from the other partner, was a more feasible way to keep the songwriting team intact. Sometimes they would sit together to finish off someone's composition, such as in the case of With a Little Help from My Friends, or add an idea here or there, such as with Getting Better. And while they did stray into writing songs completely by themselves at times, they kept up the finishing off formula throughout the Beatles' career. Earlier on, however, they did manage to sit nose to nose, as John would refer to it, from time to time. In this case, John and Paul got together at John's Kenwood home sometime in July of 1964 to write what became one of the very last songs written together from scratch, Babies in Black.
Take 7.
We goofed, man.
'Cause I think of her, but she thinks only of him. No, it's only a whim, she thinks of him.
Her name is Jim. Up there.
Okay.
Soon as you hear Jim,
One.
you're in.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
It was always nice to have an excuse to drive out into the country, Paul explains. So that generally meant that I got to John's house. They got together on this day with the intention of writing something different from their usual. We got more and more free to get into ourselves, Paul remembers. Our student selves rather than, we must please the girls and make money, which is all that from me to you, thank you girl, and P.S. I love you are about. We wanted to write something a little bit darker, bluesy. The title's dark anyway. More grown up rather than just straight pop. It was more babies in black as in mourning. Our favorite color was black as well. Sometimes the harmony that I was writing in sympathy to John's melody would take over and become a stronger melody. When people wrote out the music score, they would ask, which one is the melody? Because it was co-written so that you could actually take either. The time signature was also a marked difference for a Lennon-McCartney song. Babies in Black we did because we liked Waltz Time, Paul continued. We'd used to do If You Gotta Make a Fool of Somebody by James Ray in 1961, a cool 3/4 blues thing, and other bands would notice that and say, damn man, you're doing something in 3/4, so we got known for that. It's Babies in Black in 3/4 time, one of the first waltzes we wrote, which was interesting for us because most of our stuff's in 4/4. It's quite apparent that they were very proud of Babies in Black, evidenced by it being the first song they took into the studio to record for the Beatles For Sale, and because they continued to perform it live right through their final concert performance in San Francisco on August 29, 1966. We rather liked this one, Paul confirms. It's not so much a work job, there was a little bit more cred about this one. It's got a good middle. It's been speculated by some writers that the lyrics of this song concern John pursuing Astrid Kirchner, the former girlfriend of the late Stu Sutcliffe. It has become known that John had an interest in Astrid during her relationship with the former Beatle, and after Stu's death, John supposedly wanted to step in, but she was still mourning Stu's death. Nothing has ever been confirmed about this rumor, only the hint from Paul that the reference to the woman wearing black did indeed indicate mourning. It took 14 takes of the rhythm track to get a keeper, which encompassed John on acoustic rhythm guitar, George on electric lead guitar, Paul on bass, and Ringo on drums, along with harmonized vocals from John and Paul. That was us being the Everleys, Paul remarked.
We started to just write for ourselves and figured that the fans would listen to our extension of what we wanted to write. So we did, and we got into kind of more sort of slightly different things. This being 3/4 time. And we used to want to do this on stage. It wasn't a big fan favorite. It was a little bit
maybe
different.
hard to dance to, too, because of the
It would be hard to dance
of the groove. Yeah. But the harmonies are great. And the words
nice.
are really
It's
good.
very Everly's. We used to say, I was Phil, John was Dom. We listen to Beatles records, I always take the higher harmony than John. That was us being the Everleys. No, we were kind of proud of this one. We thought we were kind of, getting really funky folk.
In the November 1987 issue of Guitar Player magazine, George explained how they achieved the volume swells heard on the lead guitar parts of this song. While admiring Colin Manley, guitarist for the British group the Remo 4, and his use of a volume pedal, George stated, I could never coordinate it, so what we'd do is I played the part, and John would kneel down in front of me and turn my guitar's volume control. This unorthodox lead guitar style prompted George Martin to exclaim, "You want the beginning like that, do you?" This definitely indicated the change in roles George Martin was beginning to have in the studio with the Beatles. The group had specific ideas that they insisted on using, and George Martin began viewing them more as artists than as youngsters needing direction, even if it was against his better judgment. Lennon and McCartney were becoming more comfortable with the use of a chorus, unlike the common verse, bridge, verse structure of their earlier compositions. For Babies in Black, we have a complicated chorus, verse, bridge formula, which should work out to A-B-A-B-C. Although Paul identified it as being in 3/4 time, the song may be better understood probably in 6/8 time, and performed in a very country western style, especially in regards to the melody lines and vocal delivery. While John and Paul may have considered John's lower part the melody and Paul's higher part the harmony, as was usually the case, sheet music many times showed both as melody lines, while some editions showed John's lower part as melody in the chorus and verses, and Paul's dominant higher harmony as the melody in the bridge.
Hey, they went off kicking him up out there. Stand up.
Right.
Dutch hooligans.
Who's Jim Nichols?
There he is.
Have you got artificial hair?
No, man.
Oh, fish eye. Go away. Fish eye.
Go away with your fish.
Fish eye.
Fish eye's not allowed.
No good.
Fish eye's bad.
No
Fish
fish
eyes.
eye.
Oh. Yeah. No, well, German's the only language that we can speak a bit of, because we played in Germany for a long time. Well, in the early days, we played there for about a year in all. We went there for 4 months at first, back to England, then 3 months in Germany, because it was good money there. And we were getting bad money in England. Well, we were.
3 years ago.
That's 3 years ago. So we know a bit of German, so we could... Pardon? Well...
I try not to.
Anyone who is one of the best in his field, as Dylan is bound to influence people. This statement from John in 1964 indicated where he placed the credit for his change in the songwriting style. While other songs written earlier that year touched on aspects of the Bob Dylan sound, such as the puffing harmonica on I Should Have Known Better, the first song that is openly credited by all sources as being musically and lyrically influenced by Bob Dylan is I'm a Loser.
I'm a loser, take one.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So, okay, that's how we do it. Because I'll stop on the 1, 2, because that's what you'll come in with the mouth of. 1, 2, 1, 2.
That's me in my Dylan period, John explained in 1980. Part of me suspects I'm a loser, and part of me thinks I'm God Almighty. This is not to say that Dylan was the only inspiration for the song, nor is it to say that he himself didn't take a little inspiration from the Beatles as well. I wouldn't be surprised if we influenced him in some way, was how John continued the quote. The title, I'm a Loser, itself was quite bold, something that teenage fans definitely didn't view John Lennon as. Young fans didn't think twice about accepting introspective and revealing lyrics if they were from their favorite British quartet. And older music listeners could only stop and wonder why the hottest artist of the year would release a song by that name. So if you look at it that way, the Beatles recording a song entitled I'm a Loser was a win-win all the way around. July 1964 is the summer month that John most likely penned this autobiographical song. The Beatles had just returned from their hectic June 1964 world tour and were working at a more relaxed pace in their home country in July. Having a couple of recording sessions in August to start work on their next album, they set off for their first American tour, which started on August 19, 1964. We used to listen to a lot of country and western songs, Paul said in 1994, and they were all about sadness and I lost my truck. So it was quite acceptable to sing I'm a Loser. You really didn't think about it at the time. It was only later you'd think, God, that was pretty brave of John. I'm a Loser was pretty much John's song, and there may have been a dabble or two from me. From listening to the impressive walking bass lines and harmonies of the chorus, it appears that Paul's dabbles had something to do with this part of the song. While the Bob Dylan influence is undeniable in this track, lyrically and instrumentally, another new acquaintance apparently steered John in the direction of self-expression. John was interviewed regarding his first book, In His Own Right, by journalist Kenneth Alsop on March 23, 1964, for the BBC television show Tonight. While in the green room at the BBC's Lime Grove studios on this day, Alsop discussed John's songwriting. Many years later, John discussed this meeting with friend Elliot Mintz, who explains their conversation. Kenneth Alsop had in essence said to him that he wasn't terribly enamored with Beatles songs, because they all tended to be She Loves Him and He Loves Her. He suggested to John that he try to write something more autobiographical, based on personal experience, rather than these abstract images. This struck a chord with him. While John had already been depicting himself as crying and lonely in his songwriting, I'm a Loser shows John expressing raw emotions in a much more revealing way. The song was completed in approximately an hour, between 7 and 8 p.m. on August 14, 1964. Take 8 became the final complete take, with all the vocals and most of the instrumentation performed simultaneously. The overdubs were then performed, these consisting of George adding simple lead guitar passages in the open spaces of the verses, Ringo on tambourine in the choruses, and a double tracking of John and Paul's vocals during the choruses only. What adds to the potency of the lyrics is the autobiographical nature depicted throughout. John adds the telling line, "Although I laugh and I act like a clown, beneath this mask I am wearing a frown." John's clownish antics while performing live are now legendary, as are his irreverent answers in interviews during the Beatle years, which he later admitted were due to the many insecurities he was feeling. These insecurities were depicted in later songs, Help being the most noteworthy example. The word clown itself was another of Dylan's influences.
The word clown's in it, and I think I always objected to the word clown, or clown image even, that Bowie's using, because that was always artsy-fartsy. Yeah. But Dylan had used it, so I thought it was all right, and it rhymed with whatever I was doing. So that was my Dylan period.
Was that anything that, like the help thing about a personal statement?
It's part of me that suspects I'm a loser, and the other part of me thinks I'm God Almighty. It's that bit, And I don't allow that anymore.
From this point forward, with very few exceptions, John Lennon wrote about what John Lennon was feeling. He didn't write songs about Desmond and Molly, or fictional situations about romance. He kept quite firm in his resolve to use his songwriting talents to express how he felt. As he once said, "I like to write about me, 'cause I know me."
The English people can't play rock and roll music.
What do you feel about the Beatles, then?
Oh, the Beatles are great, but they don't play rock and roll, huh?
You met them quite a few times as well, in the States and in England.
Yeah, I know the Beatles.
You don't think they play rock and roll in the end?
No, they're not rock and roll. They're more rock and roll is just for. Rock and roll is just for beats. Rock and roll is an extension of 12-bar blues, and it's rock and roll is white 17-year-old kid music, and it's kid music. That's all it is. That's what rock and roll is. Rock and roll is a fake kind of attempt at sex.
But what would you call your style then? The music you sing?
Well, I don't know. I've never heard anybody that plays or sings like me, so I don't know.
I stopped listening to it. Well, it's like when Elvis went in the army. After he crashed, I stopped listening to him. I didn't listen to Nashville Skyline or any of it. I haven't listened to Dylan with both ears since Highway 64 or Blonde on Blonde. And even then it was because George would sit me down and make me listen.
I think we sussed early on that we weren't going to get anywhere unless we were different. Paul remembers about the early performing days of the Beatles. Because if you weren't original, you could get stranded. We had to play numbers no one else had. There were millions of groups around at the time, groups like us, more into blues and slightly obscure material. And because we had the unusual songs, we became the act you had to see, to copy. To find more obscure material, they turned to B-sides of singles instead of the hits everyone else was doing. John explained, "We used to do an old Olympics number called Well at the Cavern, a 12-bar thing, which was the B-side to their top 10 smash hit, Western Movies." Another favorite of John's was the B-side Mr. Moonlight, which was recorded by Dr. Feelgood and the Interns in '61. Dr. Feelgood was a pseudonym used by the American blues musician William Willie Lee Perryman, who was known more famously by another nickname, Piano Red. Born on October 19, 1911, in Hampton, Georgia, Willie was an albino African-American who took up the piano and, after his family moved to Atlanta, became renowned for his playing engagements in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and North Carolina in the 1930s. His big break finally came in 1950, when he recorded Rocking with Red and Red's Boogie for RCA Records, both becoming top 5 hits on the Billboard R&B charts. Starting in '61, Piano Red released a few singles for OK Records, with the band he had formed with guitarist Roy Lee Johnson. Willie used his new persona for the name of the group, which was entitled Dr. Feelgood and the Interns. Their single, Dr. Feelgood, managed a good showing on the Billboard Hot 100, reaching number 66, while the B-side was a song written and sung by Roy Lee Johnson, entitled Mr. Moonlight. At approximately 8 p.m. on August 14, 1964, the Beatles launched into Mr. Moonlight as a contender for the album, the first cover song they chose to include. Take 4 on this day was temporarily deemed as best, although they understandably thought differently later. The primary reason undoubtedly was George's rather experimental, shaky guitar solo, which, even during the live performance, impelled Paul to give out a couple of catcalls that would mark the track as unusable. This performance is included on Anthology 1. After the boys took an hour break from 9 to 10 p.m., they returned to EMI Studio 2 for more recording. Instead of working more on Mr. Moonlight, they opted to start and complete another cover song as a contender for the album, the 1959 Little Willie John song, Leave My Kitten Alone. They worked until 11:15 on this song, even double-tracking John's vocals. This excellent recording, unfortunately, was chosen to be omitted from Beatles For Sale, and didn't get officially released until Anthology 1. Instead, the Beatles were insistent on including Mr. Moonlight, which they reattempted at a later date. That later date was the marathon recording day of October 18, 1964. The first couple of takes still contained George's guitar solo, but this was quickly ruled out. Jeff Emmerich explains, "The stumbling block again was George's guitar solo. Not the notes he was playing, but the odd, sped-up tremolo sound he was using. John thought the unconventional sound was terrific, and personally, so did I. But George Martin insisted that it was simply too weird. After some discussion, we decided to overdub a cheesy organ solo instead. Even though I loathed the sound, I was most impressed to see Paul playing it. Up until that point, I had no idea he even knew how to play keyboards." Take 8 was the final rhythm track, onto which Paul overdubbed his Hammond organ parts, in effect replacing George's guitar solo in the song. George instead was relegated to hitting an African drum on the 2-beat of every measure the band went into a break in the song. One good thing that did come out of the first version they attempted on August 14th was John's vocal introduction. When the time came for mono mixing the song in the control room of Studio 2, 2 mixes were made. One of the vocal introduction of Take 4, and one for the rest of the song of Take 8. These 2 mixes were then edited together to form the mono mix we've all come to know, which fades out after 3 repeats of the song's title at the end. This Latin-sounding track follows a pattern that is somewhat unique, being that it is made up entirely of verses with no bridge, chorus, or refrain in sight. More than this, the first verse is different from any of the other 3 verses in the song, not only in lyrics, but in structure and length. John's convincing vocal delivery is the best, and some say only, thing that makes Mr. Moonlight work for the group. In fact, it was him who insisted on covering this obscure song as a platform for his lead vocal, which he obviously enjoyed singing. The key was even lowered slightly from G on the original version to the odd F-sharp major, probably to allow him to hit the high notes better. While the campiness of the song may come across as laughable to some, John's vocal attack and straight delivery give the proceedings plausibility. Paul's excellent knack for harmonies comes into play here also, as well as his suitably subdued bass lines, while his Hammond RT3 organ chording and solo have been lambasted by authors left and right, describing it as tasteless, cheesy, and gold lane ghastliness. We're so used to hearing it now that it's become an essential ingredient of the song. While both John's and George's guitar work are basically rhythm throughout, Ringo's percussion is played with a highly skillful Latin feel. And let's not forget George's African drum pounds. Job well done, George. Mr. Moonlight has been described quite disparagingly by authors and fans alike, suggesting it as the weakest track the Beatles ever recorded, and as the song everyone loves to hate. In the company of rockers like Kansas City and rock and roll music, which they also decided to cover for this album, Mr. Moonlight does seem a little bit too campy for their tastes. What most people fail to realize is not only were the Beatles proud of the obscure tracks they unearthed, but the sense of humor is very much on display in this song. How much of Mr. Moonlight was done tongue-in-cheek is hard to tell, but an examination of the ingredients that make up the performance is very telling. For instance, the straight, impassioned vocal delivery from Lennon, the African drum bursts from George, the monotone background harmonies, and the cheesy organ solo all demonstrate a gaudiness of the track. As author Tim Riley states in his book, Tell Me Why, by taking the whole thing so seriously, they actually make it hysterical.
Tell me about albums versus singles, because in modern time, when you put out an album, all your singles are on that album.
Yeah.
But were you guys the first guys to do singles that were not part of albums?
We had the luxury to do that.
Yeah.
You know, if somebody's coming in and they're only going to ever have one hit,
yeah,
then that had better be on the album.
Yeah.
You know, we were rather confident.
Yeah.
And then the other great thing was there used to be an A-side and a B-side, as you know.
Yeah.
The B-side earns just as much money as the A-side. So we were trying to write good A-sides, good B-sides.
Yeah.
I remember Phil Spector saying to us, you throw away all your songs. On a record, you're putting 2 good songs on there. He said you should put the hit, and then the other side, just like take the vocal off and call it Sing Along With. Or something.
Sell it twice.
Sell it twice. And we said, no, Phil, we can't do that. So, because you know why? Because we were recently record buyers.
Yeah.
And we would have felt so cheated if we'd have bought that record.
Was it typically an album a year?
It was like an album a year and 4 singles a year.
An album plus 4 additional singles.
Yeah.
The songs were varied on each album, and then every album was varied from the other.
Yeah. It was like, and the pace you were working at, it'd be like, go down and do the solo then, come on, okay. Run down, done, great.
Next.
Next.
Yeah.
You know.
Amazing.
If there was ever a Beatles track that could be described as being more than meets the eye, it would be Every Little Thing. While almost all sources praise the song, it comes across as somewhat of a sleeper track. John and Paul, in retrospect, have never spoken much of it with pride either, but upon examination we see that there is an understated beauty to the melody and a conviction in the delivery of their lyrics. What we also see is that there is a good degree of uncertainty as to many of the basic elements that make up this track. John appears to have the dominant presence in the song, but this can be viewed as John's song? John and I got this one written in Atlantic City during our last tour of the States. This is a quote from Paul in late 1964, around the time Beatles For Sale was released. This would definitely date the song as being written within a 3-day period of August 30th and September 1st, as this was the short rest period for the band in between the two legs of their hectic 1964 American tour. Another album track, What You're Doing, was also written during this short break. As for who was the primary writer, the impression upon listening to the track is that John dominates, but this turns out not to be true. Every Little Thing is his song. Maybe I threw in something, was John's comment to 1980. Paul's 1994 comments about the song sound as if this was the case as well. He says, "Every Little Thing, like most of the stuff I did, was my attempt at the next single, but it became an album filler rather than a great almighty single. It didn't have quite what was required." This comment also adds the interesting detail that Paul originally had this song in mind as the next single, which would have been their follow-up to the hugely successful A Hard Day's Night. Although it has never been officially confirmed by Paul, many sources speculate that Every Little Thing was inspired by his ongoing relationship with Jane. Since this 3-day break of the tour in Atlantic City also included the Beatles' experience with escorts, as documented by Larry Kane's book Ticket to Ride, one can easily see how the recent infidelities may have triggered lyrics about what a lucky guy he is to have Jane waiting for him at home. Ringo bashes some timpani drums for the big noises you hear, Paul said in 1964. Paul proves himself to be quite busy in this song, his bass work being intricate where necessary, and high enough in the mix to be noticed. In fact, his periodic bass overdubs mark the first time we actually hear two bass parts being played simultaneously in a Beatles song, which is something that becomes more common in later years. While his bass notes on the piano are hardly of the caliber of Liberace, they were just what is needed to create the desired effect. And, needless to say, his vocal work is spot on pitch. John's role as lead guitarist, using his custom Rickenbacker 12-string for the only time on a Beatles song, is a role he happily jumped onto whenever he felt confident enough. While he displays his lead guitar chops better elsewhere, on You Can't Do That for instance, he admirably does the job here. His vocal work is to be commended also, especially his lower harmonies in the chorus.
What difference is there since last June up to now? What sort of things have happened to you since then?
The main difference is that we've got more money and less time to ourselves. You know, everything's speeded up and we're just running around like mad.
If you ever manage to get away from the crowds, what sort of things do you like to do?
Sleep. See films, go to nightclubs, drive my car, and that's it.
Do you find any difficulty in keeping up your public image?
No. What image? Our image is just us. you know, as we were. We didn't try and make an image. It just happened, and so we don't have to keep it up. We just remain ourselves. Don't we, Ringo?
Well, we do. I mean, because
Don't know
the
about
other two
that.
were worried about.
If I'm a Loser is an update of Misery, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party is a revision of I'll Cry Instead, and a preview of You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. With its doleful minor third harmony, high snare tuning, and Carl Perkins-style guitar solo, this is the boys' most overt exercise in country and western, on an album dominated by the idiom. Again, like I'm a Loser, Confession is given a protective shell of pastiche, John hiding his confessedly very personal feelings in genre cliché. That was a very personal one of mine, John said in 1974. In the early days, I wrote less material than Paul, because he was more competent on guitar than I. He taught me quite a lot of guitar, really. Paul, however, spoke of the track as co-written by John and I, quite a nice little song. Perhaps the matter can be put to rest by Paul's recollection from his book many years from now. Ringo had a great style and great delivery. He had a lot of fans, so he liked to write something for him on each album. I Don't Want to Spoil the Party sounds more like John than me, so 80-20 to him, both of us sitting down doing a job. Certain songs were inspirational, and certain songs were work. It didn't mean that they were any less fun to write. It was just a craft, and this was a job to order, really, which Ringo did a good job on. It seems that John felt more of an attachment to the song than Paul did, probably because of the personal nature of the lyrics that mostly came from John's pen. Since John made a point of mentioning Paul's proficiency on guitar when speaking about the song, Paul may have played more of a musical role than lyrically, and therefore viewed it more distantly. Someone does need to nudge Paul though, and remind him that Ringo never did sing the song. John did. If anyone out there has a way to contact Paul, maybe you could straighten it out with him? As in other numbers written around this time, a climactic outburst occurs in the middle section with a delayed shift to the parallel key, in which the melodic peak of the song is reached. The mood of the verse-chorus is intensified by the initial shift to a high inversion of the tonic, a reinforcement of the home key used to similar effect in Babies in Black, Every Little Thing, and No Reply.
Here's the Newsweek review of the Beatles, 1964. Visually, they are a nightmare, tight, dandified Edwardian beatnik suits and great pudding bowls of hair. Musically, they are a near disaster, guitars and drums slamming out a merciless beat, all these adjectives, you know. That does away with secondary rhythms, harmony and melody. We didn't even know they existed, so how could we do away with them? Their lyrics, punctuated by nutty shouts of yeah, 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 are a catastrophe and preposterous farrago of Valentine card romantic sentiments.
Have you got any ambitions, in fact, in other spheres completely? I mean, do you want to be Prime Minister one day? Or, I mean, does that sort of thing?
No, I don't want to be, no, nothing like that, no. God. Retire, you know, that's quite...
Retire? And when do you think you'll achieve that ambition, in fact?
way things are going in a couple of years or so. No, I don't know.
Of course, everybody, I imagine, says to you the pop world is very short-lived and everything like that. And what will you do when the phase passes? Do you think the phase will pass? Does it worry you?
No. Yeah, I couldn't care less, really. I don't think. You know, if we flop tomorrow. It'd be sad, you know. Yeah. But I mean, it wouldn't really worry me.
Could you go back to doing something else?
Oh, I don't know. I'd miss doing this, but I think I'd think of something else to do. Something that I'd like to do. Write songs for other people.
Yeah. Anything completely different?
Completely different. Retire, you know, that's a completely different person.
Well, really, thank you very much. It'll be a great pleasure to watch Paul McCartney in retirement, but it'll probably be in the year about 2010.
George, what did it sound like with the bass doing a funny thing? Did it sound any good or did it sound just utterly crap? Did it? Well, see, told you. Hello to you and see how you like it.
The Beatles had a particular love for the girl groups of the early 60s. So much so, in fact, that they decided to record cover songs made popular by girl groups on their early albums. Please Please Me had 3, Chains, Boys, and Baby It's You, while With the Beatles had 2, Please Mr. Postman, and Devil in Her Heart. But for Beatles For Sale, they decided to focus primarily on their male rock and roll idols Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, Little Richard, and Carl Perkins, with Dr. Feelgood thrown in for fun. But their love for the girl groups still came through with at least one track, What You're Doing. Listen carefully to the arrangement of What You're Doing. The distinctive drum introduction, said to have been incorporated by the insistence of Paul, is a direct reference to the Ronettes' hit Be My Baby from the previous year. What You're Doing even reprises the drum beat once again towards the end of the song, just as the Ronettes did. This fact testifies to the influence that girl groups, such as the Ronettes, the Shirelles, and the Cookies, to name a few, had on their music. We wrote this one in Atlantic City, Paul said back in 1964. It's not that Atlantic City is particularly inspiring, it's just that we happened to have a day off the tour there. This would place the writing of What You're Doing between August 30th and September 1st, 1964, during their first full American tour. Journalist Larry Kane, in his book Ticket to Ride, vividly describes the first day at the hotel in Lafayette Motor Inn in North Carolina Avenue, being invited up to the Beatles suite to witness a lineup of escorts in low-cut dresses. Take your pick, were the words directed to him by John, which Kane reportedly declined. Somewhere during this day, however, they found time to write a couple of songs. What You're Doing was a bit of a filler, Paul continues. I think it was a little bit more mine than John's, but I don't have a very clear recollection, so to be on the safe side, I'd put it as 50-50. Maybe it's a better recording than it is as a song. Some of them are. Sometimes a good recording would enhance the song. Paul is definitely center stage on this song, with his double-tracked vocals and highly mixed bass guitar work. In fact, this song is an early example of the Beatles taxing the recording equipment at EMI to the limit, as they were to continue doing as their career progressed. The Beatles habitually complained early on that the bass wasn't loud enough in their recordings, so they got their way this time around. The brash sound of George's guitar work on this track is also evidence of them deliberately overloading the recording consoles. Throughout the song, Paul adds to the rhyme scheme by combining a single, 2-syllable word with 2 one-syllable words, i.e., look what you're doing, I'm feeling blue and lonely, you got me running, there's no fun in it. He used the same technique on She's a Woman. What You're Doing proved to be the problem child of Beatles For Sale, though. It took them 3 recording sessions to complete it to everyone's satisfaction, the 3rd session being on the last possible day they could squeeze it in before the deadline. Getting Ringo and George to play the song the way Paul wanted may have caused resentment and taken up time, as it often did during the band's later career.
One was with the Beatles, we never left tapes in the vault. It either went out or there was nothing there for when they died, but it wasn't a conscious decision. We just never liked having tapes left around. There's very little Beatle material, if at all, left that was never put out, and I always feel the same. I don't think, I haven't written an immigration song, as it were, because it doesn't come out that way, and maybe the feeling comes out as oppression or whatever the emotion is through a song another way, but I seldom write a sort of descriptive story in that way. It's usually a feeling I write about, a personal feeling. What can cause it could be a few things, more than just the immigration. Say a few law cases would come out as one kind of expression. I wouldn't write a sort of journalistic story about, then I went down to, I've done it with the ballads of John and Yoko, but very rarely. Then I went down to the laws, and he said this to me. What about? I try and make it more, I don't try and make it, but the feeling is to go for something that it's not, if it's my feeling, then my feeling about that feeling is that other people have that feeling no matter who they are. So I try and go for something more universal.
In May 1964, John and his wife, Cynthia, traveled to Tahiti for a month-long holiday with George and his new girlfriend, Pattie Boyd. John used this time off from their hectic Beatles schedule to write a few new songs, like Anytime at All, When I Get Home, and No Reply.
If you look at any of those books that say where the Beatles were working, you find we hardly ever had a day off, and we'd have to complain to Brian. He'd have all the pressure of people saying, yeah, we want to book the Beatles, I've got to have them, making him offers he couldn't refuse. We were having to say, we've got to have a day off, man.
We didn't get any time off. Yeah, we seemed to get 5 minutes off here and there. It might have been longer than that, but it felt like 5 minutes. But that was okay.
George Martin coined the term potboiler to characterize a fast-paced, vibrant song to open the record. Every Beatles album was to open with the so-called potboiler to build anticipation, ideally a Lennon-McCartney original. He accomplished this with energetic tracks like I Saw Her Standing There, It Won't Be Long, and A Hard Day's Night. Maintaining this pattern on their 4th album, Beatles For Sale, presented an important dilemma, because the Beatles were primarily now writing slow, introspective songs. 2 of the songs they recorded during these sessions, I Feel Fine and She's a Woman, would not be on the album. Instead, they would be picked to be featured on both sides of their most recent single release. George Martin was then forced to choose a less than enthusiastic track to start the album, and he chose No Reply. At first, John didn't seem to think too much of the song and sent it to Tommy Quickly, a recording artist under Brian Epstein's management.
Tommy Quickly is the only singer that Epstein has signed up from Liverpool who's yet to score a hit on the charts. All the ingredients are here in the studio and will take just 2 hours to mix into success or failure.
John had a tendency to undervalue his songs, which occasionally led to him offering them to other musicians. For example, Ringo would have received John's Woman for his album, Stop and Smell the Roses, if producer Jack Douglas hadn't stopped him. Not like that. As it happened, John recorded a rough version of No Reply in a hotel room to show Tommy Quickly. Guitarist Colin Manley, who performed on Tommy Quickly's version of the song, claims the demo lacked a bridge and concluded with the sound of a flushing toilet, which undoubtedly reflected John's feelings at the time about the song. Tommy Quickly did record a version of No Reply, but it never went anywhere. Since John and Paul were at a loss for new material for their next album, and since Quickly had not released a recording of the song by late September, the Beatles decided to reclaim No Reply and record it themselves. Before I Feel Fine replaced it, the track was actually considered for their next single release. We wrote No Reply together, but from a strong original idea of his, Paul relates. I think he pretty much had that one, but as usual, if he didn't have the third verse and the middle 8, then he'd play it to me pretty much formed. Then we would shove in a bit at the middle, or I'd throw in an idea. Featuring the bossa nova beat introduced to the world beyond Brazil by Tom Jobim, Stan Getz, and Charlie Bird, the song was lyrically inspired by Silhouettes, a top 5 American hit by the Rays in late '57. The opening lines of the song bear a certain resemblance to No Reply. Took a walk and passed your house late last night. All the shades were pulled and drawn way down tight. From within the dim light cast, 2 silhouettes on the shade. Oh, what a lovely couple they made. Compared to No Reply, when I came to your door, no reply. They said it wasn't you, but I saw you peep through your window. I saw the light. I know that you saw me, 'cause I looked up to see your face. John sings this one, and I do the vocal harmony, Paul explained. We tried to give it different moods, starting off quietly with the sort of vaguely bossa nova tempo, building up to a straight beat crescendo in the middle, and then tailing off quietly again. This was one of John's first songs to tell a complete story. That's my song, John said. Dick James, the publisher, said, that's the first complete song you've written where it resolves itself. That was my version of Silhouettes. I had that image of walking down the street and seeing her silhouetted in the window and not answering the phone. Although I never called a girl on the phone in my life, because phones weren't part of the English child's life. No Reply was brought to EMI Studio 2 on June 3, 1964. They'd scheduled this day to record the last track for their album, A Hard Day's Night, but things didn't go according to plan.
Yes, I was desperately ill. I was having my tonsils out.
Jimmy Nicol was a very good drummer who came along and learnt Ringo's parts very well, and obviously he had to rehearse with them, and got to know the songs very well.
They practiced 6 songs with Nicol, and after hiring him, he left to go and get ready to join the group the following day. The Beatles used the remaining studio time to rehearse a few new songs after he left. Although George never did anything with his lackluster composition, You Know What to Do, it eventually made it into Anthology 1. Then the boys gave a hurried performance of the recently penned No Reply, which is also included on Anthology 1. But it was evident that they couldn't finish the song for a commercial release without Ringo, so it was put on hold for nearly 4 months. There is some doubt regarding who drummed on this track, because neither Jimmy Nicol nor Ringo were there for this particular day. It was probably Paul, though. Because the A Hard Day's Night album had only 13 tracks, it may have been suggested that, had Ringo been present, it would have been the 14th track on that record. They began the process of properly recording the song on September 30th, 1964. Every instrument, including George Martin on piano, was recorded live during each take. They tried to repeat the bridge and the last verse on take 5, extending the song from 2 minutes 14 seconds to 3 minutes 17 seconds, after realizing how the bridge was a focal point in the song. The best take, take 8, had both John and Paul overdubbing their vocals. Chosen as a downbeat opener for the album, No Reply is one of John's most affecting songs of this period, its lyrics matching the sad succinctness of its melody. The story is complete, and the sighing added to the 9th of the final C major is accepting of the bad news. There's no reply, and never will be.
I remember travelling with the boys and being almost kicked out of an aircraft by some reporters who wanted to get on. I remember being in a lift, stuck between floors because too many people crowded in, and being escorted by police cars.
Yeah, there was all kinds of stuff. You know, we flew out of Montreal in order to avoid Ringo getting killed. You know, it was that kind of stuff was happening all the time. It was terrifying. Some people would set off firecrackers in the hall, and you'd think one of the others had got shot or something.
It was just one giant three-ring circus from which there was no let-up. The only peace they got was when they were alone in their hotel rooms, hearing the screams outside, and watching television. But that was about it. A hell of a life, really.
I loved it. I loved all the decoy cars and, you know, all these intricate ways of getting us to the gigs.
People say, doesn't it drive you mad, all these girls screaming? I'd say, no, but if you go to a football match, a big FA Cup final, you'll see all men going, "Run!" We say this is the girls' equivalent.
We did the same 30 minutes. 25, if we didn't like it, we played it fast.
Because you could never hear anything, and we were playing the repetition of all our singles, mainly, you know, just doing our hits. And then we only played 20 minutes anyway.
We never realised how fast we played when we were live, because the adrenaline sometimes would just make you, you know, instead of, oh my loving ginger, it'd be, oh my loving, very fast, you know. Ooh, very hyper and all the adrenaline, and we were talking fast and on to the next song, you know.
I remember once when we were going to go back for the second tour of America, and they were saying, oh yeah, we're going to start in San Francisco with a ticker tape parade. And that was once when I actually did say, you know, I'm not going. I'm not having a ticker tape parade. You know, I mean, it seemed like a year since they just assassinated Kennedy. And I could just imagine, you know, how mad it is in America, you know.
I've said this many times. By the time the Beatles hit America, they no longer could play live very well at all, you know. I mean, Hamburg and Liverpool, we'd been used to playing 6 or 8 hours a day or something like that, you know. Or at least nobody played less than 2 hours, 2 or 3 hours for any gig, you know. And by the time we got here, we'd got down to playing 20 minutes in an English theatre, a whole concert. And so that's why the Beatles were famous for doing 15-minute shows. We could speed it up to 15 minutes. You know. Over in America, you know, 50,000 people, it says we'd be off in 15. That was our record. So we got our kicks from seeing how fast we could do the whole show.
And here they come, the Beatles coming out of this Electra.
To say that Lennon and McCartney were naturals at writing classic pop hits is probably the understatement of all time. What is certain is that their songs were great, George Martin stated in his book, All You Need Is Ears. Starting with Please Please Me, we had 12 successive number ones. It was a unique achievement. It became almost an accepted fact of nature. The question was not whether a record would get to number one, but how quickly. Everyone was confident that they would come up with another huge smash to follow their current number one single, A Hard Day's Night. Everyone, that is, except the Beatles themselves. There was a lousy period when we didn't seem to have any material for the LP and didn't have a single, John remarked concerning the latter half of 1964. With their hectic touring schedule during these months, and a deadline of having all of these songs written and recorded for release before the year was over, the pressure was on. At first they thought John's autobiographical I'm a Loser could be the next single, but then they recorded No Reply, which they thought might work better. While both of these songs are great in and of themselves, neither of them had the commercial appeal of the caliber of I Want to Hold Your Hand or Can't Buy Me Love. Then came the undeniable charm of 8 Days a Week, which appeared to have all the necessary ingredients to make their next number one hit. But this was not to be. When the Beatles recorded I Feel Fine on October 18th, they felt this was an even better fit. 8 Days a Week was then relegated to becoming an album track. But as successful as the song became, its authors surprisingly didn't feel the same way. John said, 8 Days a Week was never a good song. We struggled to record it and struggled to make it into a song. It was Paul's original effort, but I think we both worked on it. But it was lousy anyway. John felt that way even back in 1965. Help as a film was like 8 days a week as a record for us. A lot of people liked the film, and a lot of people liked that record, but neither was what we really wanted. We knew that they weren't really us. Close friends knew that the picture and 8 days weren't our best. They were both a bit manufactured. In his book, The Lyrics, Paul writes, I don't think either one of us ever thought it was a great song, but it was a cool idea. Many writers make a connection between this song and one of the working titles for their second movie. This long-held understanding could be based on the following quote from John in 1972. I think we wrote 8 days a week when we were trying to write the title song for Help, because there was at one time the thought of calling the film 8 Arms to Hold You. While there may be some connection between the song and coming up with the idea for the title of their second movie, later interviews with Paul reveal that the inspiration for the song came from a different source. Paul relates, I showed up at John's house one day. I'd driven out from London, and because I had lost my license because of a speeding offense, I was being driven out there, and we were pulling up in John's drive, and I was talking to the driver, and I asked him, what kind of a week have you had? Have you been working hard? He then said to me, I've been working 8 days a week, Paul. After hearing that, I literally fell into John's place thinking, that's good. Neither of us had heard that expression before, so we had that chauffeur to credit for that. It was like a little blessing from the gods. I didn't have any idea for it other than the title, and we just knocked it off together, just filling in from the title. So that one came quickly. And when you examine the lyrics, it's pretty clear that the whole song was written around the title that they discovered. Paul concurs. John and I were always looking for titles. Once you've got a good title, if someone says, what's your new song? And you have a title that interests people, you're halfway there. Of course, the song has to be good. If you've called it, I'm on my way to a party with you, babe, they might say, okay. But if you called it 8 days a week, they say, oh yes, that's good. An interesting side note concerning this session was that John could be heard practicing the beginnings of a new song he was writing called I Feel Fine, which wasn't officially brought into the studio until a later recording session held on October 18th. Lyrically, the song is very surfacey. It's obvious that the catchphrase 8 days a week is the primary focus, with all the cliche-heavy surrounding lyrics being used as filler to point to the end of each verse, which highlights the song's title. Lyrics such as, ooh, I need your love, babe, and always on my mind, and love you all the time, are a far cry from the more introspective and personal songs that John was writing at that time, such as I'm a Loser and I Don't Want to Spoil the Party. This, no doubt, was a contributing factor to John's opinion of the song throughout the years, viewing it as lousy and manufactured.
That's another piece of Paul's garbage, not my garbage.
With a classic McCartney walking bass, 8 Days a Week swaggers up and down the scale of D major, much like All My Loving in E. Despite the popularity of the song in both Britain and America, the Beatles chose to omit it from any live performances during their career. The only promotion they did that included 8 days a week was a lip-sync performance on their final appearance on the weekly British TV show Thank Your Lucky Stars, which was taped on March 28th and broadcast on April 3rd, 1965. On any list of pop records that captured the soaring sunshine optimism of the mid-60s, 8 days a week would be near the top, along with I Want to Hold Your Hand and Penny Lane. Most songwriters would probably agree that the moment inspiration strikes is pure magic. Paul has a way of putting it. That creative moment when you come up with an idea is the greatest. It's the best. It's like sex. You're filled with the knowledge that you're right, which, when much of your life is filled with guilt and the knowledge that you're probably not right, it's a magic moment. It's a very warm feeling that comes all over you, and for some reason it comes from the spine, through the cranium, and out of the mouth. When that spark hits, the first instinct is to capture it while the energy is fresh. If too much time passes, that initial excitement might fade, and the end result could feel a little flat. Ideally, songwriters aim to record their ideas as soon as the song is written, if the timing works out, of course. For Paul's song She's a Woman, the timing couldn't have been any better. The Beatles already had a recording session scheduled the same day Paul had worked out most of the song. With the clock ticking, they wrapped up the writing in the studio and recorded the entire track right then and there. This put She's a Woman in the unique club of Lennon-McCartney songs that were written and recorded in a single day. Other songs in this rare group include Birthday, All Together Now, and The Ballad of John and Yoko. And in this case, the quick turnaround worked wonders. The song became a staple in the Beatles' live performances for the next 2 years, and even hit the top 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. Paul continues, I have a recollection of walking around St. John's Wood with that in my mind, so I might have written it at home and finished it up on the way to the studio. Finally polished it in the studio, maybe just taken John aside for a second and checked it with him. What do you think? Like it? Good? Let's do it. John himself verifies his input into the song, saying in 1980, we had one verse, and we had to finish it off quickly. That's why it's got such rubbishy lyrics. That's Paul with some contribution from me on the lines, probably. We put in the words, turns me on. We were so excited to say, turn me on, about marijuana and all that, using it as an expression. While Dylan thought I Want to Hold Your Hand contained a drug reference, I Get High instead of I Can't Hide, the Beatles purposefully put drug slang in a song for the first of many times on She's a Woman. As to the style of the song, Paul gives us some detail as to the inspiration. Like Can't Buy Me Love, this was my attempt at a bluesy thing. We'd always found it very hard to write the more rock and roll things. It seemed easy for Little Richard to knock them off, a penny a dozen, but for us, it wasn't quite so easy, being white boys who'd not been to a gospel church in their lives. So instead of doing a Little Richard song, whom I admire greatly, I would use the style I would have used for that, but put it into one of my own songs. So this was about a woman rather than a girl. Bluesy melody is quite hard to write, so I was quite pleased to get that. A lot of what we were listening to was already there, but I think what we did was to take it in, send it through the tumble dryer, distill it, and push it out the other end. We all loved black music. We loved the spontaneity, or seeming spontaneity of it. She's a Woman extols the virtues of a girl of mine, and let's be clear, she's not a girl, she's a woman. Because this was the interesting thing. When does a girl become a woman? To us, they'd been girls till we were around 21. And they were still sort of girls, but now we could dare to think of ourselves as men, and could think of girls as women. She's a Woman is often credited with inspiring the 60s Texas rock sound, especially the Sir Douglas Quintet and their 1965 hit, She's About a Mover. But there's a twist most people don't talk about. It might actually have been the other way round. Give a listen to the feel and the intro of the Sir Douglas Quintet's 1964 single Sugar Bee, and you can hear how the Beatles, always on the lookout for fresh ideas to borrow from the music scene, might have taken a little inspiration themselves. Paul even gives credit to John for one of the key elements of She's a Woman. He explains, John did a very good thing. Instead of playing through it and putting, like, a watercolor wash over it all with his guitar, he just stabbed on the offbeats. Ringo would play the snare, and John did it with the guitar, which was good. It left a lot of space for the rest of the stuff. That was a distinctive sound on that. While listening to all 7 takes of the song performed on October 8, 1964. An interesting observation is that George appears to have not participated. All of the takes contain only 3 instruments, which were John on guitar, Ringo on drums, and Paul on bass guitar and lead vocals. The lead guitar solo was never present in these takes, but was added as an overdub onto the take that was chosen as best. She's a Woman was written as a full-blown attempt at mimicking the colored sound, as Paul called it, so it is the most blues-like original composition they had delivered up to this point. It first wasn't so well received, Paul said in 1965. A lot of people thought I was just singing too high and that I'd picked the wrong key. It sounded as though I was screeching, but it was on purpose. It wasn't a mistake. The structural centerpiece of the track is Paul's bass line. From now on, he'd be striving to get his instrument up in volume, tone, and octave. In all respects, an experimental recording, She's a Woman is driven by its author's cannabis-cultivated curiosity to pursue every what-if he could think of. At the same time, the overriding priority was to rock hard, a token of a group that, until 1966, continued to think of themselves as just an R&B band.
And most of the boys' songs today are taken from their latest LP, which is called what, Paul?
Called Beatles For Sale.
All the time.
And it's got 8 of our songs, and the rest are 8 from 14. What's that? 9, please.
6.
Too much.
I'm not very good at counting.
So I see.
6, of
Paul,
course.
yeah.
6. Yes. 8 and 6.
How many GTs?
Well, I didn't get that one. Counting. Didn't get counting.
Who are the other numbers?
Kansas City.
2
is
Carl
one.
Perkins, 1 Little Richard, 1 Chuck Berry,
Nice.
and 1 Dr. Feelgood. And that's the rest.
What's the Chuck Berry number?
Rock and roll music, which goes on for about an hour.
We like the old numbers.
All right, well, you pick one now that isn't your own to sing for us, will you?
All right, then. Kansas City.
In our imaginations back then, John was Buddy Holly and I was Little Richard. You're always someone when you start. Paul described the personas he and John aspired to in their teenage years. Paul acquired the knack of imitating Little Richard's screaming vocals, which he was proud to display among his peers even before there were Beatles. Under these circumstances, the Beatles ended up perfecting 11 Little Richard songs, including most of his big hits, Good Golly Miss Molly, Tutti Frutti, and Lucille. Being always in search of new material, they even delved into the more obscure tracks Richard recorded, such as Miss Anne, Send Me Some Lovin', and an obscure melody that he had recorded in 1959 that paired the Lieber Stoller song Kansas City with a self-penned B-side named Hey 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 Hey. Kansas City's one of my all-time favorite records, actually, Paul told engineer Jeff Emmerich in October of 1964. Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller are known as one of the most popular and influential songwriting teams in the history of popular music. After meeting in Los Angeles and finding that they both shared a particular fascination with rhythm and blues, they began writing songs together. Their first efforts was their 1951 composition, Kansas City, which was recorded under the title K.C. Loving by Little Willie Littlefield in 1952 on Federal Records. Ralph Bass of Federal Records changed the title to something he thought sounded a little hipper. The original lyrics to this song were considered a little risque for their time, including the line, "They got a crazy way of loving there, and I'm gonna get me some." One of the first cover versions of the song was recorded on November 29, 1955, by Little Richard. While he kept pretty strict to the original lyrics, he incorporated a recurring "bye bye, baby bye" section to the song in his own flamboyant style. This version of the song did not get a single release, but it took a backseat to his high-energy original compositions such as Long Tall Sally and Rip It Up. It was then picked up by North Carolina-born Wilbert Harrison, who released the song under its original title, Kansas City, in 1959, which earned him a #1 hit in the Billboard Pop chart. While staying mostly with the original lyrics, he did change one key line, which then became the focal point of the song. "They got some crazy little women there, and I'm gonna get me one." Probably because of the huge success of the new version of the song, Little Richard re-recorded it in 1959 with a whole new approach. Back on May 9, 1956, Little Richard recorded an original composition entitled Hey 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 Hey, which ended up as the B-side of his top 10 58 hit, Good Golly Miss Molly. A decision was made to combine his original version of Kansas City with his Bye Bye Baby Bye section with the Hey 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 Hey, complete with a staccato introduction. This time, Little Richard was backed by Guitar Slim's band and had the vocal group The Chimes perform answering vocals during the Hey 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 section of the song. While this version of the song peaked at number 26 in Britain, Little Richard's popularity in America had diminished by mid-58, and this record only made it to number 95 in the US. This, of course, was enough for the Beatles to take notice of. They incorporated this medley into their live act by 1961, spurred on, no doubt, by witnessing Little Richard perform this rendition himself when they shared the same bill on different occasions. In reality, the version of the song recorded by the Beatles has extremely limited ingredients of the original Kansas City, as written by Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller. The obvious influence being the Little Richard adaptation of 1959. This is not to say that the Beatles were strangers to Leiber and Stoller material. Amongst their early repertoire were classics by the Coasters, such as Searchin', Young Blood, and Three Cool Cats, all Leiber and Stoller compositions. Two of these Beatles renditions were recorded during the Decca audition on January 1st, 1962, and can be found on Anthology 1, while the other one can be found on Live at the BBC. In a 2018 interview, Paul talked about his love of singing Little Richard style and the rehearsals of this day. That little screamy voice, that's something I just loved. I loved his records, you know, and I wanted to do that. So that gave me a sort of feature thing within the Beatles, because John couldn't do that. And I remember him saying to me, "How do you do that? How do you do that?" I said, "I don't know. I feel like it just comes out of the top of my head." And he was like, "Oh, wow." And then we had a session once where we were in the early days, and I'm about to do Kansas City. So I'm on the mic, and I'm going, Kansas City, and I'm not making it. I'm just not getting it at all. So John comes down, and he says, "Remember, it comes out of the top of your head." Jeff Emmerich, second engineer on this day, relates. From the way Paul was singing, nearly ripping his vocal cords apart, I was surprised that they had decided to do this song first. But after years of performing on stage, his voice was strong and could take the abuse. Notably, all the other Beatles, even Ringo, who hardly ever sang backing vocals, joined in on the chorus, doing the hey, hey, hey answering part. This medley was an established part of their live show at this point, and they really cut loose on it, playing with a confidence and a sheer innocent joy that was positively infectious. I knew from that minute onward that it was going to be a great session. and it was simply incredible to hear that much energy coming from the group so early in the day. They were locked in, right from the start, and that track is the definitive proof of what a great live band the Beatles were when they were in their prime. All 4 Beatles played this live, including all vocals, in 2 complete takes. Take 1 was determined to be the better one, therefore a couple of overdubs were recorded onto this take. George Martin added a piano part throughout the song, although it ended up being quite low in the mix. The Beatles then added hand claps to the closing measures of the song, beginning with the Bye Bye Baby Bye Bye section. The whole song was probably completed within a half hour. It requires a great deal of nerve to just jump up and scream like an idiot, you know, Paul stated. Anyway, I would often fall a little bit short, not have that little kick, that soul. And it would be John who would go, "Come on, you can sing it better than that, man. Come on, really throw it. Knock the shit out of Kansas City." All right, John, okay. Just when the engineers thought they had a vocal they could handle. So while Paul was obviously the key figure in their rendition of Kansas City, Hey, 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 it was John's encouragement that brought it to the next level. Writers and reviewers tend to view things individually within the band, saying Paul did this while John did that, and so on. But what we all fail to realize is that they all worked together and supported each other to construct the Beatles sound. Possibly, looking at things as a whole instead of dissected will give us a clearer and more accurate picture, as Paul's quotes indicate. Especially during the first few recording years, the Beatles were 4 men cooperating for the same goal: to take the world by storm.
John had mucked around with feedback for a while, and yes, it was intentional. He found it quite difficult to get the right amount of feedback, you know. And I think it was the first time, was it not, that feedback was used on a record? He loved things like that. He loved weird kind of effects, and it was his idea. It was great.
I seem to remember that John and George had Everly Brothers Gibsons.
Yeah, well, we had these big Gibson round
We
sound
call
hole
them Everly
electric
Brothers.
ones.
They looked like the Everleys had used. And
they weren't
John put, and so they were electric. They were acoustic, semi-electrics. They had electric facilities, I think. And John leaned his against the amp.
amplifier, yeah.
And then we were just going to go on and talk about the song, and suddenly the A string started feeding back. It was, we were just, what? Can you do that? You know, so George, well, yes, I did it on the front or something. So
but he figured out how to do it, you know, because we used to do it on stage then, live. So John figured out, you know, you just had to hit the A, and I get it by the buzzing by the amp.
So that was the start of all that. Hendrix,
John, he
feedback.
invented Jimi Hendrix.
It probably was, actually, you know. Well, you know, once you see somebody messing with feedback, it's a whole field of research, isn't it, as it became later. Yeah. But I'm sure that's how it happened. It wasn't engineered, it came from the accident, and then we made it something we could edit onto the front.
Confidence is often the key to success, and John had plenty of it. When he introduced I Want to Hold Your Hand to George Martin, he confidently declared, "You'd better come down here and listen to our next #1 record." That confidence paid off big time. The song shot to #1 in Britain and launched the Beatles into the American spotlight, setting them up for global fame. But confidence doesn't always tell the whole story. Take 1964, for example, when the Beatles were scrambling for an end-of-year single. John wasn't exactly optimistic. "I've written this song, but it's lousy," he told Ringo one morning. Still, they gave it a shot, riff and all. That song John was describing was I Feel Fine, which wound up ending 1964 with a great big bang. The story behind I Feel Fine has its fair share of twists. John later claimed in one interview that he wrote it at a recording session, while Paul said that they co-wrote it based on John's idea. One thing is clear, the song was built around a guitar riff inspired by Bobby Parker's Watch Your Step, a favorite of John's. George explained in an interview, but all riffs in that tempo have a similar sound. John played it, and I did play it as well, and it became the double-tracked sound. John elaborated, "Watch Your Step is one of my favorite records. The Beatles have used the lick in various forms. The Allman Brothers used the lick straight as it was, as evidenced in their song One Way Out. The Beatles were quite familiar with Watch Your Step, as they included it in their live performances during 61 and 62. At the time, John was obsessed with guitar riffs. I tried to get that effect into practically every song on the LP, John said, but the others wouldn't have it. I told them I'd write a song especially for the riff, so they said, yes, you go away and do that, knowing that we'd almost finished the album. As for the time of its writing, John's comment about the song being written at a recording session may very well have been true, but not at the same recording session that the song was recorded. During October 6th, the 1964 session, when the Beatles recorded 8 days a week, John was already going over the distinctive guitar riff of I Feel Fine, which can be heard in between takes. Therefore, John must have gotten together with Paul to finish off the song sometime between October 6th and October 18th, 1964, when it was actually recorded. One thing that is for certain is that it was primarily John's song with a little help from Paul, most likely on the bridge. Jeff Emmerich, who was serving as second engineer on the day this was recorded, relates. As the band began rehearsing their next song in the studio with George Martin, I used the opportunity to sit in the control room and relax for a few minutes. I was making small talk with Norman Smith, first engineer at this session, about something or other, when all of a sudden I hear this loud, buzzing sound issue forth from the speakers. "What the bloody hell was that?" I asked him, alarmed. My first thought was that a cable had gone bad or that a piece of equipment had failed. Norman chuckled. "Have a look," he said to me. I pressed my nose up against the control room glass and was astonished to see John kneeling before his amplifier, guitar in hand. We knew that if you brought a guitar too close to an amplifier, it would squeal, but John was using it in a controlled way for the first time. The squeal mentioned is, of course, the sound heard at the beginning of I Feel Fine, the explanation of which has become legendary and has been related from many sources in many ways. Emmerich gives us an interesting detail that clarifies the origin of the introductory sound on the record. Norman later related to me that they had discovered that sound purely by accident at a previous session, the night they recorded 8 days a week. It was just serendipity. During the break, John had leaned his guitar against his amp but had neglected to turn down the volume of the pickup. Just at that moment, for no particular reason, Paul had plucked a low A on his bass, and, from across the room, the sound wave set John's guitar feeding back. They loved the resultant howling, so much so that John apparently had been fooling around with the effect ever since. And with his new song, entitled I Feel Fine, he was determined to immortalize the sound on record, years before Jimi Hendrix ever started doing it. Paul's eyewitness account sheds a little more light on this subject. We were just about to walk away to listen to a take when John leaned his guitar against the amp. I can still see him doing it. He really should have turned the electric off. It was only on a tiny bit, and John just leaned it against the amp when it went, "Nyah," and we went, "What's that? Voodoo?" No, it's feedback. Wow, it's a great sound. George Martin was there, so we said, "Can we have that on the record?" Well, I suppose we could edit it in on the front. It was a found object, an accident caused by leaning the guitar against the amp. John was very proud of this accomplishment. The record had the first feedback anywhere, he claimed in 1980.
I defy anybody to find the record unless it's some old blues record in 1922, the first pop record, where I had this electric acoustic guitar and it would feed back, and the little intro which goes is the first feedback. I claim it for the Beatles.
Interestingly, when Paul, George, and Ringo are seen on the anthology film discussing the feedback at the beginning of I Feel Fine, George jokingly claims that we invented Jimi Hendrix. After the feedback was recorded, John was seen having a little trouble singing the song for more than one reason. First of all, it was in a key that was too high for him to comfortably sing. And second of all, he found it difficult to sing and play that distinctive riff at the same time. Emmerich says, John was also more prone to breaking strings than George. He attacked his guitar harder with less finesse, and I remember that happening several times during the recording of I Feel Fine, which is quite an aggressive, up-tempo song. When that would happen, he would call out, "Mal, Mal." Mal Evans was usually the one who would change the guitar strings, although on this day he wasn't there, so the task fell to Neil Aspinall instead. Neil was physically a lot smaller than his fellow roadie, so everyone had a good laugh when he walked over to take care of the problem, and John slowly looked him up and down, finally exclaiming with perfect comic timing, "God, you've shrunken the wash, Mal." As for musicianship, John is in top form. Fronting the band with his rambling, excellently played guitar riff, he also sings lead with a commanding and convincing tone, comfortable in the song's chosen key. George puts in a great performance as well, mimicking John's acoustic riff on the electric guitar to add a richness that makes it distinct from most other Beatles songs to date. Actually, no rhythm instrument is heard at all in the verses of the song, both guitars playing the guitar riff to allow for airiness in the arrangement. The guitar solo is overdubbed on top of both John and George's guitar riffs, which touch on the same notes during the fifth and sixth measures to create a surreal effect. Oh yeah, George's harmonies are good too. As for Ringo's drumming, Paul explains. The drumming is basically what we used to think of as what I'd say drumming. There was a style of drumming on What I'd Say, which is sort of Latin R&B, that Ray Charles' drummer, Milt Turner, played on the original record, and we used to love it. One of the big clinching factors about Ringo as the drummer in the band was that he could really play that so well. I Feel Fine spent 5 weeks at number 1 in Britain, and after their previous 3 American singles failed to crack the top 10, this song catapulted them back to number 1 on the American charts for 3 weeks. Even the single's B-side, She's a Woman, peaked at number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100, their highest B-side charting yet. Nearly every future Beatles single released after this in the US during their career also made it to the top spot. So in this case, John's uncertainty about I Feel Fine led to pulling them out of a slight lull in their success and cementing them in the number 1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100 for the next 6 years. I guess the song wasn't quite as lousy as John originally thought.
I like singles myself, you know. I don't collect albums, I collect singles. I hate having to buy an album just to get one tune. And there's nobody's albums, including my own, since I was 16, that I can stand listening to a whole album of one person. It's a bore, you know, but that's the game. And it's enjoyable to make them. But it'd be great. I wish they had EPs here like they used to in England, you know, where you just put 4 out. You know, there's very little music that can keep you interested or keep me interested. You know, I like singles myself, even on an album. I like it to, I like commercials. You know, I like TV commercials, radio jingles.
I am stuck on Band-Aid brand 'cause Band-Aid stuck on me. I am stuck on Band-Aid 'cause Band-Aid stuck on me. 'Cause they really stick to your fingers and they stick on bended knees.
Remember, only Johnson & Johnson makes Band-Aid brand adhesive bandages with the unique Super Stick adhesive. Depend on the protection of America's #1 bandage.
I am stuck on Band-Aid 'cause Band-Aid stuck on me.
Because I like the idea of saying it in 60 seconds. I like headlines in the newspaper, you know. I do occasionally miss the long articles you get in English newspapers, but I like if it says it in one headline, that to me is the best way of saying it. It's simple, straight, and it's over. The message is over. And if they had 60-second records, I'd be in there making them. I like them short.
Being under heavy pressure led them to comb their memories for songs they may have written years ago but never got around to doing anything with. There were certain songs I had from way back that I didn't really finish up, Paul related, but they were in the back of my mind. I'll Follow the Sun was one of those. I wrote that in my front parlor in Fortland Road. I was about 16, Paul said in an interview. This would date the song as being written as far back as 1958. He continues, "So, I'll Follow the Sun was one of those very early ones. I seem to remember writing it just after I'd had the flu. I remember standing in the parlor, looking out through the lace curtains of the window and writing that one." Former drummer Pete Best has stated that he remembers Paul playing this song on piano in between sets at the Kaiserkeller during their first visit to Hamburg, Germany. As to whether John had any part in its writing, available interviews show it was very little, if any, at all. Paul did say the following early on. "John and I wrote this one some while ago, but we changed the middle 8 bars before we actually recorded it." John, though, disclaims this in a 1980 quote, saying, "That's Paul again. Can't you tell? I mean, tomorrow may rain, so I'll follow the sun." That's another early McCartney, written almost before the Beatles, I think. He had a lot of stuff. There is a recording in existence, available on bootlegs, of the very early Beatles, known then as the Quarrymen, performing the song. The electric guitar arrangement features Paul, John, and George on guitar, with Stuart Sutcliffe on bass, and presumably Tommy Moore on drums. According to Paul, who purchased the tape from Peter Hodgson in 1995, the recording dates back to April of 1960 and was made in the bathroom of his home at 20 Fortland Road during a school holiday. His recollection of the middle 8 being rewritten before they recorded it professionally is confirmed by this early rough recording, because the lyrics of this middle section appear to say, "Well, don't leave me alone, I need you, now hurry and follow me, my dear." As for the lyrics and structure of the song, Paul explains in his book, The Lyrics. When you think about it, it's a leaving of Liverpool song. I'm leaving this rainy northern town for some place where more is happening. It's an interesting melody, too. I'd been searching for striking new combinations of notes. There's something quite original about it. One of my favorite songs of my dad's era was Cheek to Cheek, the Fred Astaire song. And what I liked was that it starts with "Heaven, I'm in heaven," and then it goes through 2 verses, and it comes back at the end of the middle 8 to "Heaven." It was like our house in Fortland Road. You went in the front door, went around through the living room, dining room, kitchen, and hall, and ended up back where you started. I'll Follow the Sun does that too. 8 takes of the full band arrangement, many of them ending with eruptions of laughter, were required before everyone was satisfied. But a couple of adjustments needed to be made as the session progressed. Jeff Emmerich explains, "At first they couldn't think of anything for Ringo to do. He played drums on a run-through, but it sounded all wrong, too aggressive and distracting. Paul wanted something more subtle. After a good deal of discussion, Paul came up with the idea of having Ringo just slap his legs in time, and that worked well. Enthralled, I watched engineer Norman Smith carefully position a mic between Ringo's knees. Then, back in the control room, he cranked up the EQ to add some extra depth to the sound." Another adjustment had to do with the simple guitar solo. Emmerich continues, "George wasn't even supposed to play that solo. For the first few takes, John did it on acoustic guitar. Despite the overall good vibe of the day, George seemed annoyed, perhaps because he hadn't been given much to do. At one point, he marched into the control room and complained loudly, 'I'd like to do the solo on this one. I'm supposed to be the lead guitarist in this band after all.' George Martin reluctantly interceded for Harrison, who was finally allowed to play the solo as an overdub. Nobody was satisfied with the result, Emmerich continues. He wasn't happy either and wanted to make another attempt at it, but a weary and slightly annoyed George Martin finally put his foot down, saying, 'No, we have to move on,' seeing as they still have to record 3 more songs before midnight. What we see here is a nice blend of both folk and pop rock elements to create a soothing and charming effect. The result became what producer George Martin described as his favorite song on Beatles For Sale. While I'll Follow the Sun may only have been recorded because of an album deadline, it is anything but filler material.
we were always self-conscious about parodying Americans, which we do and have done. I know we developed our own style, but we still, in a way, parody American music.
I wanted to have a live concert, and I arranged with Capitol to provide their engineers, and we recorded at Hollywood Bowl, but the techniques we had then in America was 3-track half-hinge, and the separation wasn't too great. To begin with, you know, you had your voices in the centre, but you had a mixture of drums and bass and guitars on your separate side tracks. But pervading the whole lot was the enormous welter of screams from the audience. I mean, it was like putting a microphone by the end of a 747 jet. It was just one continual screaming sound. And it was very difficult to get a good recording out of it with the techniques we had there.
Just like Ringo, George had his fans. And just like Ringo, George wasn't exactly cranking out hit songs in 1964. His first attempt at songwriting, Don't Bother Me, made it onto With the Beatles, but even George admitted he was so lazy when it came to writing. He did give it another go with You Know What to Do, which you can find on Anthology 1, but it wasn't quite up to par for the band at the time. By then, John and Paul had moved on from writing songs for him like they did before. So, George decided to pick a cover he loved to sing. And that's where Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby came in.
It was difficult for me to write some sort of crummy song and expect the Beatles to record it. And also to do a song with the Beatles, it was always a matter of trying to do the song that you thought they'd understand quickest, or the song you could get onto the tape the quickest, so not necessarily the song you thought was the best.
Now, although Carl Perkins is credited as the songwriter, the roots of the song actually go back much further. In 1936, country musician Rex Griffin recorded a tune by the same name, which Perkins later adapted for his album Teen Beat. John was quoted as saying that Teen Beat was one of the 2 great albums that I listened to all the way through when I was about 16. Those are the only ones on which I really enjoyed every track. The other one? Elvis's debut. The Beatles first tackled Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby in the studio on May 24, 1963, for the BBC's Pop Go the Beatles. They revisited it on March 31, 1964, recording it for the Saturday Club shortly after filming the concert scene for A Hard Day's Night. Fast forward to October 18, 1964, when they recorded it for Beatles for Sale. George, in particular, was not having a good day. He seemed to be distracted, Jeff Emmerich said, like he had something else on his mind, and I couldn't help but think that he must have been frustrated with the level of his playing that afternoon. Emmerich goes on to relate in his book that George had been pouting about not being asked to do the solo on the previous song, I'll Follow the Sun. When he did supply the solo, nobody appeared happy with the result. Something was needed to lift the tension. Emmerich continues. After their tea break, interrupted briefly by a short visit from an annoyingly ebullient Dick James, the Beatles' music publisher, the sessions seemed to start coasting downhill. They had gotten all the hard work behind them and now had to knock off 3 more songs before it got too late, because they were due up in Scotland the next day to resume touring. First, a rejuvenated George redeemed himself with an excellent rendition of Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. Not only did he sing it with enthusiasm, but he played guitar confidently and well. Even his solo, performed live, was flawless. Only 1 take of the song was needed, although it wasn't entirely a live performance. Ringo overdubbed a tambourine part, which is heard throughout the song, and George double-tracked his vocals during the last 8 measures of each verse. The most notable aspect, as explained by Mark Lewison, was the vast amount of steed, single-tape echo, and echo delay plastered over George's vocal. Lewison also goes on to explain how the rest of the instruments were picked up by George's microphone, and therefore, since steed was applied during the performance and not during mixing, the band also has a degree of this effect as well. The truth is, The Beatles didn't have time to write a full album's worth of new songs for Beatles for Sale. Even John admitted, "There was a lousy period when we didn't seem to have any material for the LP." George echoed that sentiment, saying, "For this album, we rehearsed only the new ones. Songs like Honey Don't and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, we'd played live so often that we'd just have to get a sound and record them. That spontaneity really shines through. These covers, hand-picked favorites from their early days, capture the raw energy of their Hamburg and Cavern Club performances. And with Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, you can actually hear them laid back and having fun. What could be more rock and roll than that?"
I remember the old rock songs better than I remember my own songs. If I sat down in a room and just was playing like a party, or that I had a guitar now and we were just hanging out and singing around, I would sing all the early 50s stuff, whenever those mid-50s, Buddy Holly and all that stuff. I remember those. I don't remember the chords or the lyrics or anything of the Beatles stuff. So my repertoire is that. I still go back to the stuff the Beatles performed before they wrote. All I thought I wanted to do was just sing a bit of rock and roll and not be responsible and have something deep to say and just sing bebop-a-lula,
I mean, my idols were Elvis, pre-army Elvis. I still think that was like the most exciting thing going. Little Richard, I was a big fan of Richard, but we'd met him in Hamburg. So we didn't have to go to America to meet Richard, but he was still a big idol. Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Fats Domino. We met Fats in New Orleans. He had a very big diamond watch, the shape of a big, big star, which was very impressive. Yeah, we started to meet these people who'd really just been in newspapers and on film, actually were rubbing shoulders with them.
"I'm an Elvis fan because it was Elvis who really got me out of Liverpool," John said in '75. "Once I heard it and got into it, that was life. There was no other thing. I thought of nothing else but rock and roll, apart from sex and food and money, but that's all the same thing, really." Rock and roll was everything to John, as it was for the other Beatles. That's why they refused to have the song "How Do You Do It," as suggested by George Martin, released as their first single. "We can't take that song back to Liverpool," Paul said to Martin. "We'll get laughed at." While the Beatles injected their many musical tastes into their albums throughout their career, rock and roll was their main impetus. Chuck Berry was another massive influence, Paul stated. "We'd go up to John's bedroom with his little record player and listen to Chuck Berry records, trying to learn them. This influenced John's guitar style, as Paul continues. John did play some Chuck Berry-style solos, but he gave over the solo chair to George and became known as a rhythm guitarist. I learned the solos on Johnny B. Good and Carol," John relates. "In those days, I was very much influenced by Chuck Berry. He is one of the all-time great poets, a rock poet, you could call him. He was well advanced of his time, lyric-wise. We all owe a lot to him, including Dylan. I've loved everything he's done, ever. He was in a different class from the other performers. He was in the tradition of the great blues artists, but he really wrote his own stuff. I know Little Richard did, but Chuck Berry really wrote stuff. The lyrics are fantastic, even though we didn't know what he was saying half the time. In the 50s, when people were virtually singing about nothing, Chuck Berry was writing social comment songs with incredible meter to the lyrics," John stated in 1972. "When I hear rock, good rock, of the caliber of Berry, I just fall apart, and I have no other interest in life. The world could be ending if rock and roll is playing. It's a disease of mine." Having already recorded Roll Over Beethoven, the boys moved from Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby to a wonderfully spontaneous single-take version of rock and roll music, another of Berry's myth-making hits of the mid-50s. Half the secret of this thunderous performance is that the song was continuously in their act between 1959 and 1966. Since the deadline for completing the Beatles For Sale LP was getting very close, they crammed this 9-hour-long session in, resulting in 7 new Beatles songs from start to completion. The session began at 2:30 p.m. and lasted a little past 11:30 p.m. in the evening. They had gotten all the hard work behind them, and now had to knock off 3 more songs before it got too late, engineer Jeff Emmerich relates, because they were due up in Scotland the next day to resume touring. In essence, the rest of the session was a live performance, very much like their debut album. John's urgency is nonetheless remarkable after over 8 hours in the studio, almost certainly prompted by his anxiety to do justice to a song he clearly regarded as virtual holy writ. No hint of irony intrudes as he roars through Barry's verses, creating a wave of tearful elation that sweeps George Martin into his most convincing rock and roll playing. Pitched a fifth higher than Barry's record, the Beatles' cover of rock and roll music has greater energy than the original, and is in every respect worthy of comparison with it.
I think we were hearing all the kind of stuff like the sort of stargazers, you know, those kind of vocal groups. And there was people like Guy Mitchell, you know, sort of, and Tommy Steele. And Lonnie Donegan was the big sort of starter over here, you know, for a lot of the English people. But then there started to come in these like very exciting records just over the radio, and you didn't really know, you know, like now there's an expression where he's coming from. Then you didn't know where that kind of thing was coming from. That'll Be the Day, for instance, like a very exciting record. You didn't know if they were black, white. It didn't really matter. Just a very sort of electric sound on the radio. You just got intrigued by these things, I think, you know, this kind of mystic image coming over the radio of these sort of strange new music. I mean, obviously, like all these years later, it's difficult to just say what it was about a person. But then I think you were looking at all the stars like Elvis, and over in England, Cliff Richard and stuff, and they're all, they're really good-looking fellas, you know. And then Buddy came along, and he was a fellow with glasses, and you'd never really seen anyone with glasses. You know, it always seemed that anyone who had glasses couldn't make it as a singer or stuff, or at least they had to take their glasses off and have contacts in or something. But suddenly this singer appeared, you know, these big horn-rimmed specs. We were getting ready to start the Beatles and thinking of making a group. So John Lennon, who normally wore the horn-rimmed specs, but always took them off on stage, he was now able to put them on and see the world, you know.
Buddy Holly was great, and he wore glasses, which I liked. John stated in a 1975 interview. Buddy Holly was the first one that we were really aware of in England who could play and sing at the same time, not just strum, but actually play the licks. The Beatles could relate to him more because of having similar backgrounds. Up until then, all rock and rollers, basically, had been black and poor, rural South, city slums, John continued. And the white had been truckers, like Elvis. Buddy Holly was apparently more of our ilk, a suburban boy who had learnt to read and write and knew a little more. That being the case, the Beatles' connection with Buddy Holly runs very deep. One of the first songs John learned how to play on the guitar was Holly's That'll Be the Day, which they proceeded to record at their first ever recording session in mid-1958 at Philips Sound Recording Service in Liverpool, resulting in the single 78 RPM disc to be passed around among the young quarrymen, as they were then known. In fact, there probably wouldn't have been a Lennon-McCartney songwriting team if it wasn't for Buddy Holly. One of the main things about the Beatles is that we started out writing our own material, Paul explains. People these days take it for granted that you do, but no one used to then. John and I started to write because of Buddy Holly. It was like, wow, he writes and is a musician. Paul also explains how John came to actually take on Buddy Holly's persona. John was very short-sighted. He wore glasses, but he would only wear them in private. Until Buddy Holly arrived on the scene, he would never get them out because he felt like an idiot with his big horn-rimmed glasses. But when Buddy Holly came out, the glasses came out too. John could go on stage and see who he was playing to. John was Buddy and I was Little Richard or Elvis. You're always somebody when you start. Although the actual name they were using changed and evolved throughout the different bookings they would get, they eventually stuck with the name Beatles, as inspired by Buddy Holly's band, the Crickets. Although John famously explained the name's origin as coming from a vision with a man on a flaming pie, he seriously explained the inspiration in a 1964 interview. "I was looking for a name like the Crickets that meant two things, and from Crickets I got to Beatles. And I changed the BEA because Beatles didn't mean two things on its own. When you said it, people thought of crawly things, and when you read it, it was beat music. It was only natural then that the Beatles would pay homage to someone so responsible for their existence by covering one of his songs on an album. Words of Love, written by Buddy Holly alone, turned out to be the choice. They recorded the song live, vocals and all, in 2 takes. As one of the 12 Buddy Holly songs the Beatles performed in their formative years, Words of Love was originally sung on stage by John and George. Most sources, including the liner notes of the Beatles For Sale album, suggest that Paul nudged George out and sang the song with John for this recording session. The keen ears of Ian MacDonald, as quoted in Revolution in the Head, still hears George's voice though. The answer could apparently be cleared up by an eyewitness to the day's events. Jeff Emmerich reveals, "They were clearly flagging by the time they got around to it, yet John, Paul, and George sang beautiful 3-part harmony, gathered around the single mic. Their vocals really imbued the track with warmth and love. It was a fitting tribute to one of the group's musical idols, and a perfect way to end the evening just short of midnight." So there you go. To show how instrumental Buddy Holly was to the Beatles' career, and as a tribute to him as a fan, Paul purchased the publishing rights to his catalog in 1976. Also that year, Paul, Linda, and Wings guitarist Denny Laine recorded an entire album of Buddy Holly songs, very primitively recorded to capture the style of the original recordings, which was released on May 6, 1977, as a Denny Laine solo album entitled Holly Days. So goes the impact that Buddy Holly had on the career of the biggest rock group of all time. And the excellent Beatles rendition of Words of Love stands forever as their tribute to the artist who was their biggest influence. Since their first album of 1964, A Hard Day's Night, ended up not containing a Ringo song, the boys knew they couldn't neglect him, or his growing number of fans, once again. Having recently acquired the right to record any songs in the Carl Perkins catalog, acquired from Perkins himself, they had the idea to again suggest that Ringo pick one of his songs. The Beatles had been performing the B-side to Carl Perkins' monster hit, Blue Suede Shoes, namely Honey Don't, since 1962, with John on lead vocals. However, he gracefully relinquished his role as lead singer of the song in October of 1964, allowing Ringo to use it as a vocal spotlight on their next LP. One thing needed to be settled first, though, something that George set out to remedy. Carl Perkins happened to be an invited guest to a Beatles post-show party in London on May 31st, 1964. George went straight up to him and asked point blank what key Honey Don't was in. When Carl Perkins said he had written it in the key of E, George immediately turned to John and exclaimed, "I told you we weren't doing it right." Rockabilly artist Carl Perkins was known for his undeniable charm and sincerity within his songwriting, as well as the grittiness of his vocal delivery, not to mention his characteristic guitar playing. When Carl first introduced his new composition, Honey Don't, to his band, which comprised his brothers Jay and Clayton Perkins, along with drummer W.S. Holland, there was protest because of the chord changes. His brother Jay Perkins at first refused to play the song because of the odd change from E to C7, first heard with the lyrics, "Say you do, baby, when you don't." The standard accepted blues progression would go from E to A, so the proposed chord change was quite revolutionary for its time. Carl held his ground since it was his song, saying that it was just something different that Jay needed to accept. The song was recorded in December of 1955 and released as the B-side to his million-selling single Blue Suede Shoes on January 1st, 1956. His biggest hit, peaking at number 2 on the Billboard Pop chart for 4 weeks. It was also his only pop hit. In fact, he was going to be presented with a gold record for this disc by Sun Records owner Sam Phillips on the Perry Como Show on March 22, 1956. But Carl and his band got into a serious automobile accident on the way to the show. After hitting the back of a pickup truck, their car drove into a ditch filled with water about a foot deep, Carl landing in the water face down. Drummer W.S. Holland rolled him over to save him from drowning. Carl suffered a broken collarbone, 3 fractured vertebrae in his neck, a concussion, and many lacerations. The rest of the band suffered injuries but survived, although the driver of the pickup truck died from the crash. Carl returned to recording and performing in April of that year, and continued with a string of successful hits on the Billboard Country and Western charts with Sun Records. After moving to Columbia Records, he saw the rockabilly craze ending and rock and roll taking prominence, although his touring continued through the late 50s and early 60s. This took him to England for a tour with Chuck Berry in 1964, which culminated in a party attended by the Beatles, who he was delighted to know were all great admirers of his music. Ringo specifically asked Carl for permission to record Honey Don't, which he granted. The only problem was that Ringo still hadn't done a vocal performance for Beatles for Sale. John and Paul had initially written I Don't Want to Spoil the Party for Ringo, but a decision was made at some point that they should sing it themselves, which probably ended up being a smart choice. They perfected the song in 5 takes, with everyone playing their instruments live with Ringo's vocals, take 5 being deemed the best. Along with Matchbox, Honey Don't is one of the rare songs that all 4 Beatles had separately recorded or performed on stage.
Usually the better songs, whether they were written together inspirationally, like She Loves You and From Me to You, or separately, like All My Lovin', were inspired songs. So they came from elsewhere and were delivered to us. And the ones we tried to write something usually didn't work, usually ended up on B-sides or records. And they sound like it.
When we first started, I used to get really very nervous. I was trying to think why, because, you know, we were quite popular in the beginning even. I look at the audience and I think, they all hate me. I've got to do something good to make them like me. You know, that's where my nerves came from. I think, you know, they're all looking at me like, what's he got? And over the years, I suddenly sort of realized at one point, wait a minute, they've all paid to come and see me, so they probably like me. Once I realized that they probably like me, I really relaxed.
The moody vibe of a lot of songs on the album matches the cover perfectly. It shows the Beatles looking serious in an autumn setting, shot by Robert Freeman in Hyde Park, London. The album cover was rather nice, Paul said. It was easy. We did a session lasting a couple of hours and had some reasonable pictures to use. The photographer would always be able to say to us, just show up, because we all wore the same kind of gear all the time. Black stuff, white shirts, and big black scarves. Freeman later said the idea for the cover was only briefly discussed with Brian Epstein and the band. The plan was to shoot a color photo of the group outdoors around sunset. The result was a strange example of an early 60s pop cover. It carried no band logo or artist credit, and the album title was rendered in minuscule type compared with the standard LP artwork of the time. On the cover, the lads look, well, exhausted. And who could blame them? This was their 4th album in just 2 years, squeezed in between touring America and filming a movie. They didn't have enough time to write a full set of good songs, so a few covers had to do it. But instead of the covers feeling like throwaway fillers, tracks like Kansas City, Hey, 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 and Rock and Roll Music are roaringly strong. The pace that 60s pop stars had to keep up with is wild by today's standards. Nowadays, bands usually make an album, then go on tour, then spend time looking for inspiration, then try out new stuff, and maybe release something a couple of years later. Since we usually think about the early Beatles through their albums, it's easy to imagine they followed a similar process, but that wasn't the case at all. The Beatles were constantly juggling albums, singles, EPs, and tours, with barely any time to catch their breath. It was non-stop. The business plan was simple: to squeeze as much out of them as possible before their popularity waned. This explains the mishmash of their early American releases. The Beatles were already starting to reshape the business, but Beatles For Sale is a perfect snapshot of how things worked at the time. While studio experimentation was becoming a bigger and bigger deal for the boys and George Martin, there was clearly some nervousness about going too far, and it is understandable. The Lennon-McCartney originals on this album are packed with unusual arrangements, droning sounds, abrupt transitions, and a raw edge. Blame it on weed, Bob Dylan's influence, or the sheer pressure the band was under, the album taps into a kind of gritty vibe. Even with the breezy 8 days a week, Beatles For Sale is raw, uneven, and sometimes strange, but it's also one of their most overlooked works. They take an even bigger step with Rubber Soul, and ditch the cover songs for good, but this record still feels fresh and full of energy. When you think about the crazy schedule they were under while making it, it's even more impressive how good it turned out to be. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed our in-depth look at Beatles For Sale. If you did, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and a comment. It makes a big difference in helping the channel with YouTube's algorithm. You might also want to join our member program to access exclusive perks like members-only videos, shoutouts, and more. For only $1.99 a month, you get to enjoy great, exclusive content and support a channel you like. I think that's a good deal. A special thank you to our amazing members: Myron Heller, Zach Kirk, Dan Sundquist, Sporting News Podcast, Brother Jeb, 509 Cougs, Matthew Bennett, Wilkes19, Downclads, Serdar Arpad, Matthew Polger, Bud Jenkins, John W. Baird, McLee Songs, Modern Nomad, Mozart's Baby, Will Pickering, Terrell McCoy, D. Hilt, Melatroniac, Jack Ullman, Dave Hope, and Viger Derns, Dan Bob Roberts, and Kay McCoy. That's all we have for you today. See you next time.